She was 3 steps from the door when she understood all at once that walking through it would either save the Alpha King's life or end her own. And her hand was already on the latch. The corridor behind her smelled of tallow smoke and wet stone. Ahead, past the door, was a room no servant entered without being summoned. And she had not been summoned. She had been counting his silences. That was all. 3 nights of carrying his supper tray in and finding it untouched. 3 nights of watching a man built like a doorframe flinch from the sound of his own hunting horn. Now her fingers were cold around iron, and somewhere behind that door, the king of the Emberwood was on his knees in the dark, trying and failing to become something he had been every night of his life until 6 weeks ago. She did not open it yet. She let herself stand there, breath shallow, and admit the truth she'd been circling for 3 days. Yorick Alpha King could no longer shift. And she was the only person in Castle Thornreach who knew it. Her name was Perrine. She had been in the king's household 11 days. She had a thin white scar through her left eyebrow, an old fall from a hayloft that made her look, in any light, faintly unconvinced by whatever she was being told. It was a useful face for a servant. People underestimated a woman who already looked like she doubted them. She had not come to Thornreach to notice things. She had come because her mother was dead, and her father had 6 mouths younger than hers, and the castle paid in coin, not favors. She had been given a broom, a tray, and instructions not to speak unless spoken to. Nobody had told her to watch the king's hands, but she had watched them anyway. 3 nights ago, pouring his wine, she'd seen them shake. Not from cold, not from drink, but the particular fine tremor of a body holding something back by force. She had seen him grip the table edge until his knuckles, already scarred pale from some old burn, went whiter still. She had seen him send the master of hounds away from the training yard with a voice gone flat and strange, and she had seen. Because she happened to be beating dust from a rug on the wrong balcony at the wrong hour. The king stand alone under a full moon and simply not change. Every wolf in the lower kennels had howled that night. The Alpha King of the Emberwood had stood in his own courtyard, with his fists clenched, and his teeth gritted and stayed a man. She should have told no one. She should have said nothing, forgotten it, gone back to her broom. Instead, her hand was on his door. She pushed it open. He was not on his knees. That much, at least, she'd gotten wrong. He was standing at the window with his back to her, bare-chested, sweat cooling on his spine, both hands braced on the stone sill, hard enough that she heard the grain grind under his palms. The room was dark, except for one guttering candle. He did not turn. "I did not call for a servant," he said. His voice, when it came, had none of the low double note she'd heard from him at the assembly gate the day she arrived. That thrum under the words that pack wolves called the growl thread, the sound that told every wolf in a room whose blood ran strongest. Tonight his voice was only a man's voice, flat, human. "No, Your Grace," Perrine said. "You didn't. Then leave." She didn't. He turned, finally, and the candlelight caught his eyes. Amber, both of them, except that the rim of the left one had gone the color of old ash, a gray bleeding in from the edge like frost creeping across glass. She had seen that fading before, twice in old wolves at the end of their years. She had never seen it on a man of 31 who could still put an arrow through a hare at 60 paces. "You're new," he said, and something in his face braced for the accusation, for the horror, for the servant girl's scream that would end him faster than any blade. "Say it then. Whatever you came in here to say." Perrine set down the tray she hadn't realized she was still carrying. Her hands were steadier than she felt. "Your wine's gone cold 3 nights running," she said. "That's all I came to say. I'll bring it warm this time." He stared at her the way a man stares at a locked door someone has just, inexplicably, opened from the other side. "That is not what you came to say." "No," she agreed. "But it's what I'm going to say. Tonight." She poured the wine. Her hand did not shake, though behind her ribs her heart was going like a snared bird's. When she held the cup out, he did not take it right away. He was looking at her face, at the scar through her eyebrow, at whatever expression she was wearing that she could not see and could not control. Then he took the cup. Their fingers did not touch. She made sure of that. "What is your name?" he said. Not a question. A demand dressed as one. "Perrine, Perrine." He said it like he was testing whether it would break in his mouth. "You will forget what you saw tonight. I already have, Your Grace." A lie, and they both knew it was a lie, and neither of them said so. That was the first thing they agreed on without speaking, and it would not be the last. She left him standing at the window, the cup untouched in his scarred hand, and she did not sleep that night, because she had just lied to the most powerful man in 4 packs worth of territory, and lies to alphas had a way of coming due. The wolf is supposed to be the truth of a person, stripped of manners. That was the old teaching, the one every pup learned at the knee. A man could lie, could smile with a blade behind his back, could promise and betray in the same breath. But the wolf did not lie. This wolf was hunger and loyalty and grief laid bare, 4 feet and fur and nothing hidden, which meant that a man who could not become his wolf was, by every law older than Thornreach's stones, no longer fit to be trusted with a wolf's crown. Perrine did not know the old teaching, not in those words, not yet. She only knew what her eyes told her, and what her eyes told her over the following days was a slow, terrible accumulation. The king rose at dawn and did not run the border with his second, as he had every dawn since his coronation, according to the kitchen gossip that flowed through Thornreach like a second river. He took his meetings, seated, always seated, when an alpha of his rank was supposed to stand to receive petitioners, spine straight, presence filling the hall, the way a wolf's presence was meant to fill a den. He wore his heaviest cloaks even indoors, even by the fire, as though he were perpetually cold in a way no fire could reach. And Perrine understood, 3 days after the wine, watching him hunch inside wool and fur, that he was not cold. He was hiding the stillness in him. A wolf ran hot. A man alone in his own skin, with no wolf under it, ran cold, and he knew it, and he was burying the evidence under cloth. She said nothing. She served the wine warm and did not touch his hand and kept her eyes on trays and door frames and the backs of other servants' heads. And she told herself this was wisdom. This was survival. This was exactly what an 11-day servant girl with 6 siblings depending on her wages should do. It lasted 4 days. On the 5th, Morel cornered her in the laundry yard, wringing a sheet with the particular vigor of a woman who has been sitting on gossip too long to hold it. Mireille had a chipped front tooth, the result of a childhood fall from the same kind of hayloft that had given Perrine her scar, and she covered it with her hand whenever she grinned, which was often, and she was grinning now. "You've been in his rooms," Morel said, "twice this week. Don't tell me it's the wine. It's the wine, Perrine." Morel lowered her voice, delighted and conspiratorial. "Half the kitchen thinks he's grieving something. His mother's cousin died last winter, they say, and he's taken it hard. Hasn't run the border in weeks, hasn't hunted, sits through assembly like a man carved out of wood." She wrung the sheet harder. "You've seen him closer than any of us. Is it true his eyes have gone strange?" Perrine's stomach dropped. She had told no one about the eyes. She had barely let herself think the word for what she'd seen. Fading, dying, breaking, and yet here it was, already loose in the laundry yard, already a rumor with legs of its own. "Where did you hear that?" she said too fast, and Morel's grin faltered, because Perrine's voice had come out sharp as a slap. "I don't know. Everywhere. It's just talk." Morel studied her face. "You know something." "I know he likes his wine warm," Perrine said, and walked away before her own face could betray her further. And all the way back to the kitchens she was doing arithmetic she didn't want to do. If the rumor was already loose among the servants, it would reach the guard within days, the assembly within a week, and rivals. Every pack had rivals, every crown had teeth waiting at its edges, within a fortnight. She had meant to protect a secret. She had, without quite meaning to, become one of the threads that might unravel it. That was the cost of being seen to know things. People came and asked, and even silence was an answer, if your face was easy enough to read. She was summoned to the king's study 8 days after the wine. Not by him. By Halric, the seneschal, a narrow gray man who ran Thornreach's household. With the precision of a man who had once lost something precious to carelessness and never forgiven himself for it. He was missing the last 2 fingers of his left hand. An old wolf hunt, the story went. Though nobody agreed on which hunt or which wolf, and he had a habit of resting that maimed hand flat on tabletops as though daring anyone to remark on it. "The king wishes to speak with you," Halric said, in the tone of a man delivering a sentence. "Alone." Perrine's mouth went dry. "Have I done something, steward?" "That," Halric said, "is precisely what he intends to ask you." The study was warmer than the rest of the castle, a fire built high, and Yorick was standing this time, not seated, which she understood. Even then, even 11 days into knowing this man, as an act of will, standing cost him something. He was doing it anyway, because a king did not receive people from a chair if he could help it, and pride, she was beginning to learn, was the last wall a proud man defended even as everything behind it burned. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. 3 servants, he said, without preamble, "have asked Halric this week whether it's true my eyes have changed. One asked whether it's true I no longer run with my second. Another," his jaw worked, "another asked whether the king is dying. I said nothing to anyone." Perrine said, which was true, and felt like a lie anyway, because she had said something, just not in words. She had let her face do the talking in a laundry yard, and that had apparently been enough. "I believe you," Yorick said, which surprised her enough that she looked up at him properly for the first time since entering. "You're careful. Careless people don't get themselves noticed for being careful." He crossed to the window, the same window, and for a moment she thought he might simply stand there again. Back to her, the way he had that first night. Instead, he turned and faced her, and whatever he'd been holding behind his ribs for 6 weeks seemed, for one unguarded second, to show entirely on his face. Not the king's face, not the alpha's, just a man's, exhausted past the point of pretending. "I cannot shift," he said. "You know this. You've known it longer than anyone but me. Say it back to me so I know we are speaking of the same thing, and not dancing around it like everyone else in this castle." Perrine's pulse was loud in her own ears. "You can't shift," she said. 6 weeks, he said. "Not since the treaty signing at the border stone. Every night since I have gone somewhere no one can see me. And I have tried, and there is nothing there to try with. It isn't pain. It isn't refusal. It's absence, like reaching for a limb that used to be there." He said it steadily, the way a man describes a wound he has stopped expecting anyone to heal. "If the Pax learn this before I understand it myself, I lose the crown. Possibly the throat under it. You understand what I am telling you. I understand you're telling me I know something that could kill you. I'm telling you," Yorick said, "that you are, at this exact moment, the single greatest danger to my life in the 4 territories. And, unless I am a worse judge of character than I believe myself to be, possibly the only person left who might actually help me survive it." The fire popped. Neither of them moved. "Why me?" Perrine said, when she trusted her voice again. "You have physicians, advisors. Halric, who's served your line for 30 years. Because Halric would have me confined to this room under guard for my own protection, before sunrise, and call it loyalty," Yorick said. "Because my physicians know herbs and bone setting, not whatever this is. And because," he stopped himself, visibly, the way a man stops himself walking into deep water. "Because you noticed. Everyone else in this castle has been trained, since birth, not to see an alpha's weakness. Because seeing it is dangerous and unseeing it is safe. You walked in with fresh eyes and a warm bottle of wine, and you saw exactly what was in front of you. That is either the most useful thing in this castle right now, or it will be the thing that ends me. I would like it to be the first. Perrine thought of her father, her 6 siblings, the wages that kept them fed through winter, and the very simple fact that helping a dying king keep his secret was not a servant's job description under any contract she had signed. She thought, too, of 3 nights of cold wine and a man standing alone at a window with his fists shaking, too proud or too afraid to call for a single soul to help him. "What do you need?" she said. Something in Yorick's shoulders, not relief, not quite, but the loosening of a man who has been braced for a blow that did not land, eased by a fraction. "Time," he said, "and silence, and someone willing to watch my back while I find out who, or what, did this to me. Because I do not believe, Perrine, that a wolf simply vanishes. I believe something took mine. I intend to find out what." She kept his secret for 11 more days, and in those 11 days, she learned the particular exhaustion of holding up a lie with both hands while also serving supper, scrubbing floors, and answering Mirel's increasingly pointed questions with increasingly thin evasions. She learned other things, too. She learned that Yorick took his meals almost untouched most nights, not from illness but from a body that no longer burned the way a shifter's body should, so that ordinary portions sat in him like stones. She learned that his hand, the burn-scared one, marked a decade passed in the fire of his own investiture, had begun, in the last 2 weeks, to develop a fine tremor that came and went like weather, worse toward the full moon, better just after. She learned, because she was the one who dressed his private table each evening, and therefore the one person permitted to linger in a room where an alpha king let his guard slip an inch, that he talked to himself sometimes, not madness, just a man thinking aloud with no one else safe to think aloud to, and that what he said, more often than not, circled the same question. What changed at the border stone? What changed? The border stone was where the Emberwood pack had signed a treaty with the Vane pack 6 weeks prior, a treaty of grazing rights and hunting boundaries, brokered after 2 seasons of tension, sealed with the traditional exchange of gifts between alphas. Perrine knew this the way she knew most politics, second-hand and half-attended, from kitchen talk. She had not thought about it since. She thought about it now, because Yorick thought about it constantly, and because, on the 11th night, dressing his table in the low light, half listening while he paced, he said a name she recognized. "Ansel Dray gave me that pin," Yorick muttered, more to the fire than to her. "Wore it myself that whole evening as a courtesy. 6 weeks. It fits. It fits too well, and I cannot prove a single piece of it." "Ansel Dray," Perrine repeated, before she could stop herself. "The Alpha Vane." Yorick turned, and for a moment the old wariness was back in his face. The look of a man remembering, again, that even the one person he'd chosen to trust was still, technically, a stranger. "You know him?" "I know of him," Perrine said. "My cousin's husband trades wool through Vane territory. He says Lord Dray is." She searched for a word that wouldn't sound like gossip and failed to find one. "Careful. The kind of careful that makes people nervous." "He is next in line for Emberwood's seat," Yorick said. "Should I be found unfit to hold it? Old law. If an alpha cannot shift, cannot prove the wolf beneath the crown, the assembly may depose him, and the nearest bonded kin by treaty inherits the territory until a new alpha rises from Emberwood blood. Ansel Dray's grandmother was Emberwood born. He has always had a claim, thin as ink on old parchment. He has never until 6 weeks ago had a king unfit to hold his own seat." Perrine set down the last plate very carefully, because her hands had started, quietly, to shake. "You think he did this to you," she said. "Not grief, not illness. He did this." "I think," Yorick said, "that I shook a rival's hand at a treaty table, wore a gift he gave me in good faith 6 weeks ago, and have not been myself since. I think that is either an extraordinary coincidence, or it is the least subtle assassination attempt in Emberwood's history, dressed up as diplomacy, because Ansel Dray has never in his life done a violent thing he could accomplish quietly instead. He looked at her, and something in his face had shifted from the raw, unguarded exhaustion of 11 days ago into something colder and more focused. A man who had finally found, in his own private dark, a direction to point his fear. "I need to know what that pin was," he said. "And I do not know how to find out without asking questions, loud enough for Ansel to hear them coming." Perrine thought of Brenna. Everyone in the lower halls knew Brenna, the old healer with one eye gone the milk white of blindness and the other sharper, people said, than a hawk's. Sharp enough to see things in blood and bone that no physician trained at Thornreach's own halls could name. She kept to the herb rooms below the kitchens and rarely came up into the castle proper, because, the servants whispered, the great families had stopped trusting old ways 2 generations back, and Brenna had never forgiven them for it. "There's a healer," Perrine said slowly. "Below the kitchens. She's not a physician. Not the kind you mean. But if something was done to you with more than steel, she'd know faster than anyone in this castle, and she owes no loyalty to anyone above the salt line who'd think to ask her first." Yorick studied her for a long moment. "Bring her to me," he said, quietly. "She won't come to you," Perrine said, with the particular certainty of someone who has heard a person's reputation described a dozen times over laundry. Old women who've been ignored by kings for 40 years don't come running because a king finally wants something from them. "You'll have to go to her." "An alpha king," Yorick said, with the ghost of something that might, in a healthier week, have been a laugh, "does not sneak through his own kitchens after midnight to visit a hedge healer." "No," Perrine agreed, "but a servant girl walking a guest to the herb rooms to treat a headache raises no one's eyebrows at all." That was how, on the 12th night, the Alpha King of the Emberwood found himself hooded and cloaked like a common man, following a servant girl down a back stair he had never in his life had cause to use, into a low room that smelled of dried yarrow and tallow, and something underneath both that Perrine could not name, but that made the hair rise on her arms the moment she crossed the threshold. Brenna was waiting for them. Not surprised. Perrine would remember that later, turn it over, wonder at it, but waiting, as though she'd known for days that a king would eventually come down her stair. The old woman's clouded eye fixed on nothing, her good eye fixed immediately, unerringly on Yorick. "Take off the hood," she said. "I don't treat shadows." He took it off. Brenna looked at him for a long moment, his face, his stillness, the gray creeping the rim of his left eye. And something in her expression, which had started as simple professional appraisal, sharpened into recognition, and then, unmistakably, into something like dread. "Someone's fed a thread into you," she said. "A false one. I can feel it from here. It's sitting under your collarbone like a leech in still water, drinking slow so you don't feel it going until there's near nothing left to drink." "A thread," Yorick repeated. "What thread?" "A bond thread." Brenna's good eye flicked, briefly, to Perrine, and something in that glance made Perrine feel, absurdly, as though she'd been caught at something. Every wolf carries the capacity for one, the true kind, the kind that grows between mates and roots a king's power in more than blood. But a thread can be counterfeited, planted with the right token, the right blood, the right malice, by someone who understands the old craft better than any healer left living ought to admit knowing. A false thread doesn't bond you to anyone. It just feeds, draws the wolf down into the man and holds it there, drop by drop, same as a leech holds still and drinks and lets you believe you're only tired. "Can you remove it?" Yorick said, and Perrine heard, under the king's flat control, something close to pleading. Brenna was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had gone careful, the voice of someone about to say a thing they know will not be welcome. "No," she said. "Not by cutting it out, not by burning it, not by any craft I know how to work alone. A false thread only starves when something realer than it takes its place. You cannot remove a lie from a man's chest, Your Grace. You can only fill this with something true enough that the lie can't survive the crowding. Her clouded eye turned, unerring despite its blindness, toward Perrine. A false thread breaks under the weight of a real bond. You need a true one, deepened, not forced. Whoever planted this in you knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't just take your wolf. They took the one thing that could give it back and made it the very thing you'd be too afraid or too proud to reach for. The room went very quiet. Perrine felt the old woman's clouded eye on her like a hand on the back of her neck and understood, with a lurch that went all the way to her stomach, exactly what Brenna was not saying out loud in front of a king, who had, until 11 days ago, believed himself entirely alone in his own castle. They did not speak of it on the walk back up the stair. Yorick's hood was up again, his shoulders set in the particular rigid line of a man absorbing a piece of information too large to hold steady. Perrine kept 2 paces behind him, the way a servant should, and said nothing. Because there was nothing safe to say, and because the thing Brenna had not said aloud was sitting between them now like a third person in the corridor, taking up space neither of them wanted to acknowledge. At his study door, he stopped, turned. "You understand what she meant," he said. "Not a question." "I understand what she implied," Perrine said carefully. "Say it plainly. I am tired of people in this castle speaking to me in careful shapes." Perrine made herself meet his eyes. Both of them, the whole one and the fading one. "She meant you need a bond, a true one." And she looked at me when she said it, which means either she thinks I'm the most obvious candidate in this castle, or she's an old woman who enjoys watching people squirm. "Possibly both," Yorick said, and there was, again, that ghost of dry humor under the exhaustion, gone as quickly as it came. "Perrine, I want to be plain with you. Because you have been plain with me since the night you walked into my rooms uninvited with cold wine and an unconvincing lie. I did not bring you into this to manufacture a bond out of necessity. I would not do that to you. Chain a girl to a crown because a healer says it's the only cure. That is not." He stopped, visibly searching for the words. "That is not how I intend to survive this." "Then how?" Perrine said. "Do you intend to survive this?" He didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. Not yet, and they both knew it. And for a moment they simply stood there in the corridor. A king with a stolen wolf and a servant with a scar through her eyebrow, each of them refusing to say the thing the healer had already said for them. "Go to bed, Perrine," Yorick said finally, low. "It's late, and thank you, for the healer, for all of it. I won't forget that you didn't have to bring her to me." She went. She did not sleep. She lay in the narrow servant's bed she shared with 2 other girls and stared at the dark and thought about a king's hand, scarred and shaking, and a healer's clouded eye, and the specific terrifying shape of the word, bond, and did not let herself finish the thought, because finishing it felt like standing at the edge of something with no floor beneath it. Turning point 1 had already happened, though neither of them had named it that. She was his greatest danger and his only ally, and both of those things were now permanently, irreversibly true. And there was no version of the following weeks where she could set either one down. What came next came faster than either of them expected, because secrets in a castle the size of Thornreach have a half-life measured in days, not months. And Ansel Dre, whatever else could be said of him, was not a patient man pretending to be patient. He was a patient man who had simply run out of patience roughly 6 weeks after planting a leech in a king's chest, and was beginning, quietly, to wonder why his investment hadn't yet paid its dividend. 3 days after the herb room, Lord Ansel Dre arrived at Thornreach unannounced, with an escort of 12, and a smile that did not reach either of his eyes. Perrine saw him for the first time from the gallery above the great hall, where she was meant to be dusting, and instead stood frozen, tray forgotten against her hip, watching a tall man in gray-blue vein colors cross the flagstones like he already owned them. He had a beard black as pitch except for one streak of gray, exactly the width of a finger, just right of center. The kind of detail a person only notices if they've been told to look for something wrong in a room, and then can't stop seeing it. His voice, when he greeted Yorick before the assembled hall, never rose and never fell. It stayed level the entire time, pleasant, unhurried, the voice of a man reciting a script he had rehearsed so many times it no longer required effort. "Your Grace looks well," Ansel said, and something in the flatness of it made the hair on Perrine's arms rise the same way Brenna's herb room had. Rested. "I confess I'd heard rumors otherwise. Servants do talk." "Servants," Yorick said, standing. Perrine noted, though she alone in that hall understood what standings cost him now. "Talk about everything and know very little. I trust your journey was uneventful, Lord Dre." "Uneventful," Ansel agreed, "though I find myself here on rather more than a courtesy visit. The Assembly of Packs convenes at the turning of next month's moon, as is custom every 10th year, and as is custom, every sitting alpha must show his wolf before the gathered packs to prove his fitness to hold his seat." He let that sit a moment, his level voice somehow making the silence after it worse than any threat shouted. "I only mention it because I understand the rumors have reached even Vane territory. I would hate for your Grace to be caught unprepared." The hall was silent. Perrine's hands had gone cold around the tray. "I am never unprepared," Yorick said, and his voice, she would think about this later, replay it, did not shake, did not so much as waver. Though she alone knew what it cost him to hold it level while a man who had planted a parasite in his chest stood in his own hall and smiled about it. "Of course not," Ansel said. "I'll look forward to the assembly then, as will every pack in these territories." His gaze swept the hall once, idle, unhurried, and caught for 1/2 second on the gallery above, on a servant girl frozen with a tray against her hip and an expression she had not managed to make careful in time. It was 1 second, perhaps less, but Perrine felt it land on her like a hand closing, and she understood, with a cold certainty that settled into her stomach and did not leave, that Ansel Dre had just filed her face away somewhere, and that men who planted leeches in kings' chests did not forget faces without reason. That night, Yorick summoned her again. Not to his private rooms this time, but to the war room, a narrower chamber with a single map table and no fire lit, as though he had chosen the coldest room in the castle on purpose, to match the cold currently sitting in his ribs. "He's forcing my hand," Yorick said, without preamble, pacing the length of the table. "The assembly trial isn't due for another 8 months by the old calendar. He's moved it up, and he's done it publicly enough that I can't refuse without confirming every rumor in this castle. If I stand before the assembly and fail to shift, I don't just lose the crown. Every pack that's ever chafed under Emberwood rule gets a legal, bloodless excuse to carve up the territory, starting with Vane." He stopped pacing. 1 month, Perrine. I have 1 month to either find a way to shift or find a way to disappear before the trial does it for me. "You won't disappear," Perrine said, before she'd decided to say it. "You're not the kind of man who disappears. I've watched you stand through meetings that were costing you more than anyone in that hall understood. For 11 days running, because sitting down felt like losing. You're not going to run from an assembly." Yorick looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. "No," he admitted, "I'm not." Which leaves the other option, and we both know what Brenna said the other option requires. The war room felt very small suddenly and very cold, and Perrine was aware of every inch of distance between them and every reason that distance existed. His crown, her broom, the 11 days that separated a girl who poured wine from a man who wore one. And how none of those reasons had stopped either of them from ending up here, in a room with no fire, having the conversation neither of them had wanted to be the first to start. "I won't ask it of you," Yorick said quietly. "I told you that in the corridor and I meant it. Whatever this is, whatever Brenna thinks it has to be, I won't have you believe it's owed. A servant's loyalty isn't a mate bond, and I won't let a healer's diagnosis turn one into the other because it's convenient for my crown." "I know you won't ask," Perrine said. Her heart was going hard enough that she was certain he could hear it in the silent room. That's not the same as it not being true. She had not meant to say that. It came out of her anyway. Honest in the way that only exhaustion and fear and 1 month's deadline could make a person honest. And she watched it land on him. Watched something in his face crack open, just slightly. Just enough that for one unguarded moment the Alpha King of the Emberwood looked less like a king, and more like a man who had spent 6 weeks convinced he was dying alone, and had just been told by the one person who'd noticed him at all that he wasn't. He crossed the room, stopped a foot from her, closer than a king, stood to a servant, closer than propriety allowed, close enough that she could see the gray creeping his left eye had crept a fraction further, even in the days since she'd first seen it. His hand came up, hesitated in the air between them, close enough that she felt the heat of it without the touch. "Perrine," he said, low, and it was not a command this time, not a king's flat address. It was a question, the first real question he had asked her since the night she'd walked into his rooms with cold wine. Down the corridor, a door slammed, Halric, making his rounds, his uneven gait unmistakable even through stone. And Yorick's hand dropped before it ever landed, and the distance between them snapped back into its proper, careful shape, servant and king, king and servant. And neither of them said anything at all, as the seneschal's footsteps passed the war room door and faded, and the moment that might have become something else went, instead, back into the dark where it had come from. "Get some sleep," Yorick said finally, rough. "We have a month. I intend to use every day of it finding another way before I ask anything of you that you can't take back." Perrine left the war room with her pulse, still loud in her ears, and the distinct, unsettling knowledge that a line had been approached and not crossed, and that the not crossing had cost them both something anyway. The month narrowed fast. Halric grew suspicious of her comings and goings within the first week. Not accusing, not yet, but watching. The way a steward watches anything new in a household he has spent 30 years keeping orderly. Mirail grew hurt, in the particular quiet way of a friend who senses she's being shut out of something and doesn't understand why. And Perrine, torn between the king's secret and the one friendship she'd made in 11 days, turned 19, made the mistake that would cost her most. It happened on a night she was tired past sense, scrubbing pots long after the rest of the kitchen had gone to bed. Mirail beside her out of loyalty rather than duty. And Perrine, worn thin by weeks of careful silence, let one true thing slip loose because she needed, badly, to say it to someone. "He winces," she said, not meaning to, staring into greasy water. "Every time he avoids the training yard. Like it costs him something just to walk past it." Mirail went still. "Who?" Perrine heard the word land and understood, half a breath too late, exactly what she'd done. "No one," she said. "Forget it." But Mireille was not a cruel girl. Only a curious one, and curious girls talk, especially to cousins who write letters, especially cousins whose husbands serve in the households of neighboring lords. And Perrine would not learn until later, would not learn until it was already too costly to unlearn, that Mirail's cousin's letters went, eventually and entirely without malice, into a household in Vane territory, where a level-voiced man with one gray streak in his beard read every scrap of gossip that crossed his desk with the patience of someone who had learned, over years, that patience was cheaper than force. She would carry the shame of that slip for a long time, not because Mirail had betrayed her. Mirail never knew what she'd passed along. Never understood the weight of a single overheard sentence about a king's flinching. But because Perrine herself had known better, had been told the stakes in plain words by the man they belonged to, and had let exhaustion make the choice fear should have made instead. It would cost Yorick nearly 2 weeks of his one remaining month. It would cost Perrine something harder to name, the last of her own certainty that she could hold a secret this size without it, eventually, holding her. The assembly trial moved up again. 10 days, now, instead of the month Ansel had first granted, and this time the summons came not as a courtesy but as formal writ, sealed and delivered by a vain rider, who did not wait for a reply. Yorick read it standing at his own war table, and something in his face, when he finished, told Perrine before he said a word that whatever ground they'd gained in the last 3 weeks, and they had gained some small true things, an hour here and there where she sat with him and simply talked, about nothing, about her siblings and his childhood, and the particular loneliness of a crown, an hour that had, without either of them naming it, begun to feel like the outline of something neither of them was ready to call by name. All of it had just been set on fire. 10 days, he said. He knows something moved his timeline. He knows I'm closer to an answer than I was a month ago, and he's decided not to give me the chance to use it. How would he know that? Perrine started, and then stopped, because she already knew, because the flinch in her own chest arrived a full second before her mind caught up to it. "Oh," she said very quietly. "Oh, no, what?" Yorick said. "Muriel," Perrine said. "2 weeks ago. I said something. I didn't mean to. I was tired. I said it without thinking, and I told myself it didn't matter, because she doesn't know anyone who." She stopped, because she could hear how thin that sounded even as she said it, and because Yorick's face had gone carefully, dangerously still. "You told someone," he said. "I told a friend 1 sentence about a wince. I didn't. Do you understand?" Yorick said. And his voice had dropped into something colder than she'd ever heard from him, colder than the war room's unlit fire. "What 1 sentence costs me right now? Do you understand that I have spent 11 days building enough trust in you to bring a stranger down my own back stairs, to stand in a room with no fire and tell you things I have told no one else alive, and that the entire time you were still talking?" "I didn't know it would reach him," Perrine said, and hated how small her voice had gone. "I was careless. I know that. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't put my wolf back," Yorick said, and it was cruel, and he knew it was cruel even as he said it. She could see the knowledge cross his face a half-second behind the words, too late to call them back, and the room went very quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight, that presses. "I want you gone," he said finally, low, "reassigned. Out of my household, out of Thornreach's upper halls before the assembly trial. I can't afford another loose thread, Perrine. Not now. Not with 10 days left." Yorick. It was the first time she'd used his name without title, and it landed between them like something breaking. "Your Grace," he corrected, flat, final, already turning away from her, already retreating behind the king's face she'd first seen from a gallery weeks ago. "Halric will see to your reassignment in the morning. That's all." She stood there a moment longer, waiting for him to look at her again, to take it back, to be the man who'd nearly touched her hand in this same room 3 weeks ago. He did not turn around. She left, and did not let herself cry until she'd made it 2 full corridors away, out of earshot of any door that might belong to him. Perrine was gone from Thornreach's upper halls within 2 days, sent, on Halric's cold instruction, to the outer laundry house a mile beyond the castle walls, ostensibly for reassignment, in practice a demotion so complete it amounted to exile. She scrubbed linens in a cold stone building with 3 other girls who didn't know her and didn't ask, and she told herself, in the long silent hours over the washtubs, that she'd deserved it. That 1 careless sentence had nearly cost a king his crown, and a king was owed better than a servant who couldn't keep her mouth shut. She told herself that for 6 days. On the 7th, she stopped believing it, because the arithmetic of the thing had finally caught up with her properly. Yorick had 4 days left before the assembly trial, no wolf, and, as far as she knew, no one else who had ever stood in that war room with him, no one else Brenna had looked at with her clouded eye and gone quiet over, no one else close enough to matter. He had sent away the one thing a healer had told him might save his life, out of fear and pride, dressed up as necessity. And Perrine understood, scrubbing linen with hands gone raw, that this was exactly the thing Brenna had warned them both about without saying it outright. The strongest people are undone by the secrets they can't bring themselves to ask help for, and Yorick, for all his careful 11-day trust, had in the end chosen pride over asking. She did not know yet that he had chosen it and was already regretting it, that he had stood in that same war room 3 nights running since her exile, staring at the space where she used to sit, and said nothing to anyone about how wrong the silence felt. He came to the laundry house on the 8th night, 3 days before the assembly trial, hooded again, alone this time. No escort, no explanation given to anyone at Thornreach for where the king had gone, which was itself, Perrine would understand later, an act of considerable recklessness for a man with a rival actively hunting for cracks in his authority. She was alone in the washroom when he entered, wringing out the last of the day's linens, and she did not at first recognize him under the hood, only realized, when he pulled it back, that her hands had stopped moving entirely. "I was wrong," Yorick said, without preamble, standing in a doorway that had never in its existence held a king. "I have had 8 days to sit with what I said to you, and every single one of them has made it worse, not better. You made a mistake. I have made several in the same span of time, including the one where I stood in a war room and told the only person willing to help me that her mistake was unforgivable, when I have spent this entire ordeal making mistakes of my own and calling them necessity." He stopped. His hands, she noticed, were not steady, not the tremor of the missing wolf this time, but something raw. "I sent you away because I was afraid. Not of the assembly. Of you. Of how much it had started to matter that you were the one in the room when things were worst. That frightened me more than Ansel Dry ever has, and I punished you for it instead of admitting it, because that was easier than saying it plainly, and I am done being a man who chooses easier over honest. I came to say I was wrong, and to ask, not order, ask, whether you'd come back, not for the crown, for me, if that's a thing you're still willing to consider after how I sent you away." Perrine set down the linen in her hands very slowly. "You made me leave 4 days before the most dangerous moment of your life," she said. "And you want me to just—" "I know what I'm asking," Yorick said. "I have no right to it. I'm asking anyway. Because I would rather lose the crown having told you the truth than keep it having sent you away out of fear, and let you believe, for 1 more hour, that you deserved to be sent." She studied his face for a long moment, the fading eye, the exhaustion carved into it, the particular rawness of a proud man who had walked a mile in the dark to say a thing he clearly found harder than facing an entire assembly of rival packs. "You're an idiot," Perrine said finally, and something in her chest, wound tight for 8 days, loosened all at once. "A king and an idiot, both at the same time. I'm aware," Yorick said, and the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, the first one she'd seen from him in weeks. "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes," Perrine said. "But if you send me to a laundry house again, I will let the assembly watch you fail to shift, and I will bring my own chair to enjoy it from." "Noted," Yorick said, and crossed the small room in 3 strides, and this time, when his hand came up, there was no seneschal's footstep to interrupt it, and no title between them to stop it. His palm found her jaw, careful, like he still half expected her to pull away, and she didn't, and for 1 long moment the washroom with its cold stone and its smell of lye held nothing else in the world but the 2 of them and the space closing between them. He did not kiss her, not yet. He pressed his forehead to hers instead, breath unsteady, and said low, 3 days, Perrine. I don't know what a bond requires. I don't know if 3 days is enough to do anything but get us both killed trying." "Then we'd better not waste them," Perrine said, and felt him go still, and felt, underneath his skin where her hand had come to rest against his chest, without her quite deciding to put it there, something that was not quite a heartbeat, and not quite anything else she had words for. A thread, thin and cold, exactly where Brenna had said a leech would sit, drinking slow. They did not resolve it that night, though everything in the washrooms, close dark, seemed to be leaning toward resolution. A hand at her jaw, a forehead against hers, the particular charged stillness of two people who have already admitted the thing and are only arguing silently about how fast to let it become real. It was Perrine, in the end, who stepped back first, breathing unsteady, because 3 days was not enough time to do this carelessly, and because Brenna's warning sat in her mind like a hand on the shoulder. Deepened, not forced. Whatever this became had to be true, or it would be exactly the kind of thing Ansel had already tried to counterfeit, and counterfeits, she understood now, were precisely the danger. "Not like this," she said low, her hand still flat against his chest, feeling that cold thread under her palm like a live thing. "Not because we're afraid and out of time. If this is real, it has to survive being slow, or it isn't the thing Brenna meant." Yorick's jaw worked. She watched him want to argue and choose instead, to trust her, the same choice, in reverse, that she had made walking through his door a month ago. 3 days, he said again, quieter. "We don't have slow." "Then we have 3 days of not slow that still isn't false," Perrine said. "There's a difference. I intend to find it before the assembly does." She returned to Thornreach that night, reinstated by a king's word that Halric received with visible, if silent, disapproval, and the 2 days that followed were the strangest of Perrine's life. Days lived at the exact center of a story too large for her, in a castle where half the servants now watched her with open curiosity, and the other half with wary suspicion, while she and Yorick built, in stolen hours between his desperate preparations, for a trial he still did not know how to survive, something neither of them had a name for yet. It grew in visible steps, the way Brenna had said a true thing had to grow. A hand that lingered half a second longer passing a cup. The two of them standing closer at the war table than the map required, neither pulling back first. A night on the battlements, cold enough that their breath showed. When he told her about his mother, dead a decade, and the particular ache of inheriting a crown from a woman who'd never lived to see whether he'd wear it well. And Perrine, without thinking, took his scarred hand in both of hers, not to steady it, just to hold it, and he let her, and neither of them said anything about what that meant, because saying it might have made it too fragile to survive the saying. The near touch came on the second night, his mouth a breath from hers on the same battlement, both of them still, neither closing the last inch, because some instinct in both of them recognized that the last inch mattered too much to spend carelessly, with a trial bearing down and everything still uncertain. He drew back first this time. "Not because I don't want to," he said, rough, "because I want it to be more than a thing we did out of fear of running out of time." "I know," Perrine said, and pressed her palm flat against his sternum again, where the cold thread still sat, and felt, or thought she felt. She would never be entirely certain. Something in it shiver. Thinner than it had been 2 nights before, as though even this much honesty was already, slowly, starving it. The night before the assembly, Perrine went to Brenna alone, without telling Yorick, because a question had been sitting in her since the herb room that she hadn't found the nerve to ask in front of a king. "Why me?" she said, standing in the low light of the herb room. Brenna's clouded eye fixed, as always, on nothing and everything at once. "You looked at me the first night like you already knew something. Like you were waiting for me specifically. Why?" Brenna was quiet a long moment, weighing something. "What was your grandmother's name?" she said finally. "Your mother's mother." Perrine blinked, thrown. "Yisold. Why does that?" "Yisoldi of the Ashwold line," Brenna said, and something in her flat, sure tone made the hair rise on Perrine's arms. Weavers they were called, 3 generations back. Before the old families decided threadsight was too close to witchcraft for comfort, and hunted the name out of every court in these territories. Your grandmother's blood could see bonds the way I see wounds, could tell a true thread from a false one at a glance, could feel a leech mark from across a room the way you'd feel a draft under a door. That gift doesn't vanish in 3 generations, child. It sleeps. It skips. And then every so often it wakes up in a girl who thought she'd simply gotten good at noticing things. Brenna's good eye found Perrine's face and held it. You didn't notice the king's stillness because you're clever, though you are that too. You noticed because some part of you has been able to see bonds, true ones, false ones, since before you knew there was a name for the seeing. That is why I looked at you the way I did. I was not guessing that you might matter to this. I already knew. Perrine stood very still, the weight of that settling into her slowly, reordering everything she'd believed about her own 11 days at Thornreach. Not luck, not simple sharp-eyedness, but inheritance, old and buried and waking now at exactly the moment it was needed. Does he know? She said. Yorick, does he know what I am? Not yet, Brenna said. That's not mine to tell him. But child, tomorrow, when you stand in front of that assembly, you are not only a servant who happened to notice a king's secret. You are a weaver, whether you've claimed the name yet or not, and that matters more tomorrow than it has ever mattered in your life. Remember that when Ansel Dray tries to make you small in front of every pack in these territories. He does not know what you are either. That may be the only advantage you walk in with. The assembly convened at dawn, on the wide stone circle beyond Thornreach's walls, that every pack called the trial ground, ringed by standing stones older than any crown currently claiming them. Every alpha of the 4 territories stood present with their seconds, their advisors, their retinues, a sea of pack colors, gray-blue vein banners thick among them, Ansel Dray positioned near the center, with the particular satisfied stillness of a man who believes he has already won. Yorick stood at the circle's edge in the plain gray of emberwood. No crown, no ceremony. The old law required a king to shift as a man stripped of ornament, proving the wolf beneath the office rather than the office itself. Perrine stood in the crowd of household staff, permitted to witness, close enough to see his face, too far to reach him, her heart going hard enough that she was certain the wolves nearest her could hear it. The assembly elder called the trial open. The law was read aloud, old words about fitness and blood, and the wolf as the truth beneath the crown. And then Yorick stepped into the center of the circle, alone, and the whole gathering went quiet, in the particular way a crowd goes quiet when it senses it is about to watch something break. He closed his eyes, reached, visibly, for the shift that had abandoned him 7 weeks prior. Nothing happened. A murmur went through the standing stones. Not loud, but present, the sound of 100 assumptions confirming themselves at once. Ansel Dray's face did not change, but something in his stillness sharpened satisfaction, pulling taut. Again, the assembly elder said, not unkindly, but with the particular weight of a formality that would not be repeated indefinitely. Yorick tried again. Perrine watched his jaw tighten, watched the tremor return to his scarred hand, watched 7 weeks of fear and pride and stolen wolf converge on a single moment in front of every pack in the territories, and watched it fail again, the same aching absence Brenna had described, a limb reached for and found not there. I believe, Ansel Dray said into the murmuring crowd, his level voice somehow cutting through it more effectively than any shout, that we have our answer. Perrine did not remember deciding to move. She only remembered that one moment she was standing in the crowd of household staff, and the next she was walking into the circle itself, past startled seconds and outraged whispers, toward the center where Yorick stood with his eyes still closed and his whole body braced for a failure he had not yet been permitted to fully complete. Wait, she said, and her voice, thin as it felt, carried farther than she expected in the shocked silence her presence had created. He's not unfit, he's poisoned. The murmur turned, all at once, toward her instead. Ansel Dray's careful stillness cracked. Just slightly, just enough that Perrine, watching him with eyes that had apparently always been able to see more than sharp-eyed noticing, saw something under his level composure flicker toward alarm. "A servant," Ansel said, recovering his flatness with visible effort. Interrupting a sitting of the assembly. "Remove her." "No," Yorick said, opening his eyes, and his voice, even 7 weeks stripped of its wolf's undertone, carried enough of the old command that the guards who'd started forward stopped where they stood. "Let her speak." Perrine turned to face the gathered assembly. Every alpha, every second, every pack that had ever chafed under or bowed to Emberwood rule, all of them staring at a laundry house servant who had just walked into the center of their oldest law. 7 weeks ago, she said, the king wore a gift at a treaty signing. A pin, given by Lord Dray's own hand. Her eyes found Ansel's and held them, and she watched the flatness in his face fight, visibly, to stay flat. "There is a false thread sitting in the king's chest right now, planted the night he wore that gift, drinking his wolf down, drop by drop, so slowly he mistook it for grief. I can see it. I have been able to see it since the night I first walked into his rooms with a tray of cold wine, though I did not have a name for the seeing until yesterday. It is not weakness that stands in this circle. It is theft." The assembly erupted. Not chaos, not yet, but the low, roiling murmur of 100-pack loyalties recalculating in real time, alphas turning to their seconds, old alliances shifting weight. "A servant's claim," Ansel said, louder now, the level control cracking further, against the word of a lord who has served this assembly's treaties faithfully for a decade. "I would ask what proof." "Then let her prove it," the assembly elder said, old eyes sharp, "here before us, as the old law allows any claim of sabotage to be tested before a trial's result is sealed." Perrine looked at Yorick. Yorick looked at her, and in his face was every version of the last month at once. The man at the window, the king in the war room, the idiot in the wash-house doorway, and underneath all of it, something that had grown slow and true over 3 impossible days, and was, she understood now, standing in this circle in front of every pack in the territories, entirely ready to be seen. "Brenna said a false thread breaks under the weight of a real one," Perrine said, low, only for him now, though the whole circle was straining to hear. "I don't know if 3 days was enough. I don't know if this works, but I would rather try it in front of every pack in these territories than watch you lose your crown to a lie neither of us built." "Perrine," Yorick said, and it was not a king's voice at all now, stripped down to just a man's, raw and certain. "Whatever happens in the next minute, I chose this before I understood what a bond was. I want you to know that, not because Brenna said I needed one. Because somewhere in the last month, you became the thing I reached for instead of the wolf. And I didn't notice until it was already true." She closed the last distance between them. The one they'd left standing on a battlement 2 nights before. The one neither of them had wanted to spend carelessly. And this time neither of them stopped. The kiss was not long, not dramatic by the standard of songs. But it was true, unhurried despite the circle of watching alphas, unhurried despite Ansel Dray's face going from flat to something close to panic, and Perrine felt, under her palm, where it still rested against Yorick's chest, the cold thread that had sat there for 7 weeks shudder once, violently, like something small and starving finally recognizing it had lost. Yorick made a sound low in his throat that was not quite pain and not quite relief, and staggered. Perrine caught his arm, alarmed, and then understood, watching his face, that this was not collapse. This was a door being forced open after 7 weeks locked. He closed his eyes again. This time, when the shift came, it came all at once. No hesitation, no reaching for an absent limb, but the sudden, overwhelming rush of a wolf, too long denied finally permitted to arrive. The transformation took him to the ground in a controlled roll. Fur the deep umber of old Emberwood bloodlines, rippling up over a body that had spent 7 weeks, convinced it no longer remembered how, and when it finished, The wolf that stood in the center of the trial ground was enormous, and whole and utterly, unmistakably present. The assembly went silent, and then, all at once, did not. What happened to the false thread happened fast enough that only Perrine, with her newly named sight, saw the whole of it. A thin, cold line, visible to her alone as it snapped, whipped backward across the circle like a lash recoiling, and struck true toward the one hand that had planted it, coiling briefly, visibly even to those without her sight, around Ansel Dreye's wrist before dissolving into nothing. That, the assembly elder said, into a silence gone entirely different in character, is the old mark of a broken leech thread returning to its source. I have seen it twice in 40 years, both times at trials for sabotage. Old eyes turned to Ansel, and there was nothing forgiving in them. Lord Drey, explain yourself, or forfeit every claim you have ever held in these territories. Ansel Drey's careful flatness, built over years, over a decade of patient plotting, did not survive the weight of 100 Alpha's stares and a mark that had just, undeniably, named him. He tried, for one final moment, to hold his voice level. This is theater, a servant's trick. And then his own second, a woman who had followed him loyally for 8 years, stepped back from his side, visibly, publicly, the first crack in an alliance that would, within the hour, collapse entirely. I have served you faithfully, she said, into the listening silence, and you never told me you'd planted a leech in a sitting king. I did not sign my pack's loyalty to a man who murders slowly and calls it diplomacy. Ansel Drey stood alone in the center of an assembly that had, 1 breath ago, been prepared to hand him a crown, and understood visibly that it was over. He went to his knees. Not from any law compelling it, no guard forced him, but because a man who has spent a decade building patient, quiet power on lies has, in the end, nothing left to stand on once the lies are seen, and the old habit of pride cannot hold a body up on its own. Mercy, he said, and his level voice cracked finally on the word. Your Grace, I ask. You planted a parasite in my chest, Yorick said. Man again now. Breathing hard, Perrine's hand still at his arm, and let me believe for 7 weeks that I was dying alone of something wrong with me. You forced a trial you knew I couldn't survive, and you would have watched me lose my crown, my territory, possibly my life, and called it the old law working as intended. I am not inclined toward mercy this morning, Lord Drey, but I am inclined toward the law, which is more than you offered me. He turned to the assembly elder. Strip his seat. Exile him from all 4 territories, effective this hour, on pain of a wolf's justice should he be found within our borders again. The elder nodded, and it was done, old and simple and absolute. Ansel Drey, who had planted a lie in a king's chest and forced a trial meant to expose it, left the trial ground on foot, alone. His escort of 12 dissolved within the hour into pledges of loyalty to whichever pack would still have them, and by nightfall the gray-streaked beard and the level voice that had haunted 7 weeks of Perrine's fear had become simply a story other packs would tell as a warning for a generation. The assembly did not disperse quietly after that. There was ceremony to be observed, old law requiring witness and record, and Perrine stood through most of it at the circle's edge again. Servant once more in the eyes of the gathered packs, watching Yorick accept the formal confirmation of his crown from Alphas, who, an hour ago, had been ready to watch him lose it. But when the ceremony ended, he did not return to the crowd of advisors waiting to congratulate him. He crossed the circle instead in front of every pack still gathered, and knelt. An Alpha King on both knees on the stones of his own trial ground, in front of a laundry servant who had walked out of a crowd 2 hours earlier, with nothing but the truth and the nerve to say it. I sent you away when I was afraid, he said, loud enough that the nearest packs heard every word and did not seem to care that they did. I let pride do the deciding when I should have asked for help the moment I understood what was happening to me. Brenna was right about more than the thread. The strongest people are undone by exactly the secrets they can't bring themselves to ask help for, and I very nearly proved her right in the worst possible way. You didn't have to come back after how I treated you. You didn't have to walk into this circle in front of every pack in these territories and risk your own name to save mine. I am not asking you to stay because a healer said a bond would save my life. That's already happened. Ansel's thread is broken. Whatever debt this month created between us is paid. I am asking, now, with nothing left forcing either of us, because I want you. Not the weaver's sight, not the convenient timing. You. However you choose to answer that, in front of every pack watching, is the answer I'll keep. Perrine looked around, briefly, at the ringed stones, the watching alphas, Brenna somewhere at the circle's edge with her clouded eye fixed, unmistakably, on her with something that might have been pride. She thought of a broom and a wage and 6 siblings fed through winter, and a scar through her eyebrow that made her look unconvinced, and 11 days that had become, somehow, the whole shape of her life rearranging itself around a man who had chosen, in the end, honesty over pride. I'm not answering because you're kneeling in front of an assembly, she said. I want that understood, by you and everyone else standing here. I'm answering because 3 days ago, in a wash house that smelled like lye, you walked a mile in the dark to tell me you'd been wrong, when no one would have blamed you for staying proud and silent instead. That's the man I'd choose, crown or no crown, wolf or no wolf. She held out her hand. The one that had first steadied a cup of wine 3 nights before either of them understood what they were building. Yes. He rose and took her hand in front of every pack in the 4 territories, and this time, when he kissed her, there was no restraint left in it to spend carefully. The whole circle watching, the old stones standing witness the way they'd stood witness to 100 years of Emberwood kings before him. And none of it mattered half as much as the simple fact that a king who had spent 7 weeks convinced he was dying alone was, for the first time in longer than he could remember, entirely and visibly not alone at all. She would learn, in the months that followed, that a crown adjusts to new weight faster than people expect and slower than they'd like. There were still advisors who bristled at a laundry house weaver taking a seat beside their king. There was still Halric, cautious for weeks before his caution finally softened into something like respect. Once he watched her hold her ground in council sessions with the same flat, unconvinced eyebrow she'd worn her first night in his household. There was Mirelle, tearful and mortified when she finally understood the shape of the letter she'd unknowingly sent toward Vane territory, and Perrine, who was understood better than anyone in that castle what it cost to be forgiven for a careless mistake, forgave her without making her ask twice. There was Brenna, who took Perrine down into the herb rooms once a week after that, not as a healer instructing a patient, but as an old woman finally teaching a young one the shape of a gift. 3 generations had nearly let die out entirely. The old craft of threadsight, the difference between a true bond and a counterfeit, the particular responsibility of being the only eyes in a castle that could tell one from the other. And there was Yorick, not perfect, never pretending to be, still, on hard nights, the kind of proud man who needed reminding that asking for help was not the same as failing at strength. But he asked now. That was the thing that had changed, the thing Perrine noticed most, in the quiet hours when the castle slept and they sat together at the same war table where he had once told her, coldly, to leave. He asked. He said the hard thing before it had time to fester into 7 weeks of silence. He had learned, in the worst month of his life, that the strongest thing a king could do was not carry every wound alone behind a locked door. And that the woman who had noticed him standing at a window in the dark, when every other soul in his castle had been trained since birth not to see it, had not just saved his crown. She had taught him how to be found. Years later, when the old story got told, and it always got told in halls and kitchens and firelit yards, the way every good story about a king and the servant who saved him eventually is, the tellers would linger longest on the moment in the circle, the kiss that broke a leech thread in front of 100 watching alphas. But Perrine, when she heard it told wrong, would correct only one detail, quietly, every time. It was not the kiss that broke Ansel Dre's leech. It was the month before it. The wine poured warm 3 nights running. The corridor where a king almost reached for her hand and didn't. The wash house where he walked a mile in the dark to say he'd been wrong. The thread had been starving long before the circle. The kiss had only finished, what honesty, slow and unglamorous and entirely unwitnessed, had already begun. That was the part the songs left out. It was, Perrine always thought, the only part that mattered.